The human heart is a cartography of quiet desires, a map of hidden longings that often lead us toward horizons we were never meant to reach. We seek belonging in the shadows of greatness, believing that proximity to light might finally warm the cold corners of our own history. Tonight, we find ourselves in the mist-laden expanse of the English countryside, where the rolling hills of Lincolnshire meet the gray, shifting tides of the North Sea. It is a landscape of ancient stone and persistent drizzle, a place where the wind carries the scent of damp earth and the distant rhythmic lowing of cattle in the fading light. In a small house within this quiet county, a young girl named Jane Andrews grew up surrounded by the muffled sounds of a family struggling to keep its head above water. Jane was a woman who found her early peace in the tactile world of fabric and thread, her fingers moving with a steady, calming precision as she learned to mend what was broken and create beauty from the simple materials at hand. The air in those early years was often heavy with the unspoken weight of financial strain. We can imagine the young Jane sitting in a living room where the wallpaper had begun to peel at the edges, listening to the sharp, percussive sound of her parents' voices rising in another argument over the ledger. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a household dispute, a thick, suffocating stillness that settles over the furniture like dust. Jane would later recall the sensory details of these moments with a striking clarity. The way her mother would ask the children to search down the sides of the velvet settee, their small hands brushing against crumbs and lint in a desperate search for stray coins to buy a simple loaf of bread. The metallic scent of copper pennies and the rough texture of the coat pockets they turned inside out became the sensory markers of her childhood. It was an environment governed by the stern, unspoken rule of keeping one's troubles within the family walls, a philosophy of private endurance that would follow Jane into the gilded halls of power. By the time she reached her teenage years, the internal weather of Jane's life had become as turbulent as the coastal storms of her home. She moved through the corridors of Grimsby College of Art, a young woman with a keen eye for fashion and a deep-seated need for the stability she had never quite known. The smell of oil paints, the scratch of charcoal on heavy paper, and the soft hiss of a steam iron in the design studio provided a temporary sanctuary. Yet, beneath the creative focus, a quiet unraveling was taking place. She would later speak of the shadows that lengthened over her mental health during this time, the heavy, hollow ache of an eating disorder, and the private grief of an abortion. These were the hidden weights she carried as she transitioned into the professional world, finding a steady rhythm as a designer of children's clothing for Marks and Spencer. The work was predictable, the fabrics soft and comforting, but the horizon was about to shift in a way she could never have predicted. At the age of 21, Jane's eyes fell upon an anonymous advertisement in the pages of the Lady magazine. The paper was crisp between her fingers as she read the request for a personal dresser. There was no mention of royalty, no hint of the palaces that lay ahead, yet something about the modest listing pulled at her. Within a few months, the daughter of Lincolnshire found herself standing before Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York. We can picture the scene, the high ceilings of the interview room, the distant chime of a grandfather clock, and the Duchess, known to her inner circle simply as the boss, offering a warm, boisterous welcome that must have felt like a sudden burst of sunlight. Jane arrived at King's Cross Station with nothing but a single suitcase and 10 pounds in her pocket, a self-described country bumpkin stepping into a world of unimaginable scale. The transition was a study in sensory overload. One moment, Jane was navigating the modest streets of her youth. The next, she was being whisked through the side doors of Buckingham Palace. Her new room held a small, fragrant posy of flowers and a handwritten card from the Duchess, a gesture of inclusion that surely felt like the end of her long search for belonging. The life of a royal dresser is one of intimate proximity and profound invisibility. It is a world defined by the rustle of silk, the polished gleam of tiaras, and the hushed tones of corridors where the history of a nation is written in the margins. Jane found herself at Balmoral, the air crisp with the scent of pine and peat smoke, engaging in long, drifting conversations with Princess Diana. These were years of a strange, borrowed brilliance, where the daughter of a struggling family lived a life of Highland balls and international tours, her identity slowly merging with the service she provided to the crown. However, even as her career thrived in the light of the monarchy, the foundations of her personal life remained brittle. In 1990, she married Christopher Dunn Butler, an executive whose world of corporate logic often clashed with the erratic, demanding schedule of the royal household. The marriage was a fragile thing, eventually buckling under the pressure of Jane's blossoming career and the quiet, restless flings she sought outside the marital bed. By 1995, the union had dissolved into the finality of divorce. Curiously, this personal fracturing only served to deepen her bond with Sarah Ferguson. The Duchess was navigating her own high-profile separation from Prince Andrew at the time, and in their shared grief and shared status as women adrift from their husbands, they found a mutual language. They were two women in a palace, watching the sun set on their old lives while trying to maintain the polished veneer expected of them. For 9 years, this was the rhythm of Jane's existence, a steady, repetitive cycle of selecting outfits, packing trunks, and maintaining the impeccable image of the Duchess. But the stillness was not meant to last. In 1997, the professional tether was abruptly severed. Jane was let go from the staff, a dismissal that felt less like a career change and more like an eviction from the only world that made sense to her. The blow was compounded by the feeling of being blindsided, a sudden return to the cold reality of her own life, without the protective shadow of the Duchess to shield her. She fell into a deep, gray depression. The silence of her apartment, a haunting contrast to the bustling energy of the palace. It was in this state of profound vulnerability that she was introduced to Thomas Cressman, a charismatic financier whose arrival promised a new kind of sanctuary. Thomas was a man of charm and perceived stability, a businessman who moved through the world with an easy confidence. To Jane, he represented a final chance at the security she had been chasing since those lean years in Lincolnshire. Their romance was a whirlwind of high-end dinners and escapes to the French Riviera, where the Mediterranean sun warmed the skin and the sound of waves against the shore suggested a life of eternal summer. She pinned every hope, every fragment of her identity, onto the prospect of a marriage proposal. She wanted the ring, the title of wife, the permanent anchor in a life that had become increasingly untethered. But beneath the surface of their glamorous travels, the relationship was beginning to rot. The carrots of affection were frequently replaced by the stick of psychological games. As we look back at the autumn of 2000, we see a tragedy that had already begun to right itself in the small daily cruelties of a failing love. Jane would later describe a complex, toxic dance, her own deep-seated insecurity meeting Thomas's profound fear of commitment. It was a relationship of threats and reconciliations, of bags packed and then unpacked in the heat of a moment. The air between them grew heavy with the weight of things unsaid and the sharp edges of things whispered in anger. On the 17th of September, the couple returned from the Riviera to a London that was cooling into autumn. The argument that erupted that night was not a new one, but it carried a different, more desperate energy. It was a confrontation over the future that would end in a silence so profound it would echo through the British legal system for decades. The investigation would eventually reveal a scene of shattered peace. But for now, we leave the couple in the flickering light of their home, the shadows lengthening as the night deepened, and the distant rhythmic ticking of a clock marking the final hours of a life that had once been lived in the service of queens. Would you like me to continue with the details of that fateful night and the legal aftermath that followed? The silent corridors of the royal residences often held secrets, but few were as heavy as the ones Jane Andrews carried when she first stepped into the service of the Duchess of York. To understand the gravity of what would eventually occur in that quiet bedroom in Fulham, we must first look at the quiet, steady climb of a woman who seemed, for a time, to have found her place in a world of velvet and protocol. Jane was a person who found a certain meditative peace in the tactile nature of her work. She took comfort in the weight of heavy silks, the precise alignment of a row of pearls, and the soft, repetitive hiss of a steam iron smoothing out the creases of a royal gown. These were the mundane anchors of her daily life, the small, controlled tasks that kept the chaotic edges of her inner world at bay. In those early days of 1988, the atmosphere at Buckingham Palace was one of formal elegance and a very specific kind of hushed industry. Jane had arrived with a single suitcase and a 10-pound note, a young woman from Lincolnshire who had grown up in a household where money was a source of constant, whispered tension. The smell of old wood polish and the faint, floral scent of expensive perfumes permeated the air of the staff quarters. It was a world away from the grit of her childhood, where her parents would search the crevices of the sofa for spare coins to buy a loaf of bread. According to the accounts she would later provide, that early transition into the royal household felt like a dream. She was 21 years old, a designer of children's clothing who had answered a blind advertisement in a magazine, and suddenly, she was being welcomed by the Duchess herself with a posy of flowers and a card signed simply, "The Boss." The rhythm of her life became dictated by the royal calendar. There were the summers at Balmoral, where the air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Jane would spend her mornings preparing tweed suits for the Highland dampness, and her evenings ensuring that the Duchess's gala dresses were pristine. She found herself in a position of extraordinary intimacy, a shadow in the room while the most famous women in the world shared their private thoughts. She would later describe long, quiet chats with Princess Diana, the two of them finding common ground in the strange, gilded isolation of their roles. In these moments, the world felt secure. The investigation into her later life would show that Jane thrived in this environment of structure. The rules were clear, the expectations were set, and for a time, the shadows of her past, the struggles with her health, and the echoes of her parents' arguments seemed to recede into the background of the grand tapestries. By the early 90s, Jane's life appeared to be a masterpiece of stability. She had married Christopher Dunn Butler, an executive who provided a sense of middle-class grounding. Their home was a place of soft lighting and the comfort of routine. However, the demands of her career began to pull at the fabric of her marriage. The royal schedule was relentless, requiring her to be away for weeks at a time, moving between London, Windsor, and international tours. The distance grew, not just in miles, but in the quiet spaces between them. Jane would later admit to a couple of flings during this period, small, desperate attempts to find a connection outside the rigid confines of her professional and marital roles. The divorce in 1995 was a quiet affair, a fading of a flame that had never quite caught hold. Yet, as her marriage ended, her bond with Sarah Ferguson only deepened. The Duchess was navigating her own highly publicized separation and divorce from Prince Andrew, and the two women found themselves in a shared state of transition. They were both outsiders who had been brought into the inner circle, only to find the walls closing in. Jane became more than a dresser. She was a confidant, a loyal protector who guarded the Duchess's privacy with a fierce, quiet intensity. The two women moved through the halls of Sunninghill Park, the Duchess's home, surrounded by the soft click of heels on marble and the distant sound of children playing. It was a time of shared vulnerability, but for Jane, it was also a time when her identity became entirely fused with her service. The shift began in 1997. The atmosphere in the royal household is often compared to a changing of the tide, sometimes slow and predictable, other times sudden and cold. After 9 years of dedicated service, Jane was told her position was being eliminated. The news arrived like a sudden chill in a warm room. She felt blindsided, a woman who had given her entire 20s to a family that was now moving on without her. The loss of her job was not just a loss of income, it was a loss of her anchor. She fell into a deep, heavy depression. The quiet rooms of her life, once filled with the busy work of royal duties, were now silent. The ticking of the clock in her own home felt louder, more intrusive, marking the hours of a life that suddenly lacked a clear direction. It was during this period of profound uncertainty that she met Thomas Cressman. Tom was a financier, a man of charisma and means who seemed to offer the security Jane so desperately craved. Their initial meetings were filled with the excitement of a new beginning. They would spend evenings in dimly lit restaurants, the air warm and smelling of good wine and expensive cigars. To Jane, Tom represented a chance to rebuild, a new structure to replace the one she had lost. But as the investigation would later detail, the foundation of their relationship was built on shifting sands. Jane was seeking a commitment that would heal her sense of rejection, while Tom, by her account, was a man who valued his independence above all else. The romance was whirlwind, a rapid succession of shared weekends and quiet dinners that masked the growing cracks beneath the surface. They moved into a house in Fulham, a charming property where the sunlight filtered through large windows, and the neighborhood was characterized by the peaceful hum of affluent London life. But inside the house, the silence was often broken by the sharp tones of disagreement. According to the trial testimony, Jane had pinned all her hopes on a marriage proposal that never came. She wanted the ring, the title of wife, the public acknowledgement of her value. Tom, however, seemed content with the status quo. The soft spoiler of this narrative is that their different needs would eventually collide in a way that no amount of royal protocol could ever fix. The tension between them was a slow burn, a quiet accumulation of resentments that grew like frost on a window pane. Jane described a cycle of volatility, arguments that would flare up over small things, followed by cold silences that lasted for days. She alleged that Tom used her insecurities against her, dangling the carrot of marriage only to pull it away when she reached for it. He, in turn, found her neediness stifling. The mundane details of their life, the grocery lists, the choice of curtains, the planning of vacations, became battlegrounds. By the time they departed for a trip to the French Riviera in September of 2000, the air between them was heavy with the weight of things unsaid. The trip to France was supposed to be a reconciliation, a chance to find the warmth they had once shared under the Mediterranean sun. They stayed in beautiful villas, the scent of lavender and sea salt filling the air. But the beauty of the landscape could not mask the ugliness of their conflict. On the flight back to England, the argument reignited. It was a dispute about their future, or lack thereof. By the time they reached their home in Fulham on the evening of September 17th, the situation had reached a breaking point. The house, which should have been a sanctuary, felt like a cage. Inside the quiet walls of the Fulham home, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that was almost palpable. The smell of rain-damp pavement drifted in through the vents. Tom, feeling the situation spiraling out of control, did something that signaled the gravity of the moment. He called the police. He told the operator that someone is going to get hurt, and that he wanted someone there to stop them from hurting each other. It was a request for intervention, a plea for a third party to break the cycle of their escalating emotions. But the police did not arrive in time to prevent the tragedy. Jane's account of that night is a fragmented, harrowing narrative of fear and reaction. She alleged that after the call, the violence escalated. She claimed she was pushed, that she was sexually assaulted, and that she fled the house in a state of shock. The night air was cool as she walked the streets, the distant glow of street lamps casting long, distorted shadows on the pavement. She returned a few hours later, hoping the fire had burned out, but the embers were still hot. They went to bed in a state of exhausted, bitter truce. According to Jane's testimony, she woke in the middle of the night to the sensation of being hit. She claimed Tom was looming over her, threatening her life. In a moment of pure, primal survival, she jumped from the bed. Her hands found a cricket bat and a knife, objects that had no place in a bedroom, yet were there in that moment of crisis. The result was a scene that the investigators would later spend months reconstructing. The stillness of the house was broken, and by the next morning, Thomas Cressman was no longer alive. Jane fled once more, leaving the quiet house behind, her mind a blur of static and grief. The investigation would later focus on the clinical details of the room, the position of the body, the blood spatter on the white linens, the mundane items left undisturbed on the nightstand. It was a scene of domestic horror that stood in stark contrast to the refined world Jane had once inhabited. The woman who had spent a decade smoothing the silks of royalty had now left a permanent stain on the fabric of her own life. As we look at the legal aftermath and the trial that followed, we see a woman caught between two narratives, one of a victim fighting for her life, and another of a scorned lover who took what she could not have. The shadows in the royal dresser's life had finally overtaken the light, leaving a silence that would take nearly 2 decades to truly resolve. Would you like me to continue with the details of the manhunt, the trial, and the years she spent behind bars? The complexity of the human heart is often found in the spaces between what we show the world and what we whisper to ourselves in the dark. We are all, in some way, architects of our own identity, building structures of habit and history to shield us from the colder drafts of reality. Tonight, we find ourselves in the quiet, rain-slicked streets of a small English village, where the amber glow of street lamps reflects off the pavement, like memories of a sun that has long since set. In the stillness, we meet Jane Andrews, a woman whose life was a series of carefully stitched seams that eventually, and tragically, began to pull apart at the edges. As the rain begins to steady itself against the glass, I want you to let go of the day's weight. The world outside is moving at a pace you no longer need to match. Within this space, there is only the rhythm of the weather and the low, steady hum of a story that has already reached its conclusion. You are safe here, anchored in the present, while we reach back into a time of royal gates and quiet country roads. Before we travel into the deeper shadows of this history, it is helpful to know where the path leads. This is not a tale of sudden shocks, but the long, slow trajectory of a woman who rose from the humble landscapes of Lincolnshire to the highest gilded halls of Buckingham Palace, only to find herself retreating into a silent, permanent shadow. It is a story of how ambition, when met with the fragile glass of the ego, can shatter into something sharp and irreversible. The air in this room is heavy with the scent of cedar and the distant metallic tang of the rain. It is a protective container, a place where the past cannot reach you, only inform the silence. We are looking back at Jane's life not through the lens of a headline, but with the detached, soft-focused lens of a historian watching the snow fall on an old estate. The events are settled. The courtroom is empty. The prison gates have already opened and closed. There is nothing left to be decided, only the quiet observation of a life that moved from the mundane to the extraordinary and back again. To understand the woman who would one day walk the corridors of the royal household, we must first look at the soil from which she grew. Jane was born into the crisp, often unforgiving air of Grimsby, a town in Lincolnshire where the wind carries the salt of the North Sea and the scent of industrial resilience. Her childhood was defined by a specific kind of English struggle, the struggle to maintain dignity when the purse is nearly empty. Her parents were people of immense pride, the kind of pride that keeps the front doorstep scrubbed clean, even when there is no coal for the fire. They were a family trying to keep up appearances in a neighborhood where everyone was looking for a sign of weakness. There is a particular sensory memory Jane once shared, a detail that grounds her ambition in a very physical reality. Imagine a young girl, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, kneeling on a worn carpet in a living room that felt perpetually cold. Her fingers are small and cold as they reach deep down into the dark, dusty crevices of an old settee. She isn't looking for a lost toy. She is searching for copper coins, the stray pennies that might have slipped from a pocket weeks ago. She is searching for enough to buy a single loaf of white bread so the family can have tea. The fabric of the sofa is rough against her skin, and the silence of the house is heavy with the unspoken stress of her parents. The quiet desperation of a cold house can forge a powerful ambition, a need to find a world where the flowers are always fresh and the tea is always warm. This early environment created in Jane a sharp, watchful eye. She became a student of textures and surfaces. While other children played, Jane found solace in the tactile world of fabrics and the structured beauty of design. She eventually made her way to the Grimsby College of Art, a place where the gray skies of the coast were replaced by the vibrant splashes of paint and the structured lines of charcoal sketches. Here, she could reinvent herself. She wasn't the girl searching for bread money. She was a creator. She was a woman who could take a flat piece of cloth and turn it into a garment that changed how a person moved through the room. Her first professional foray into the world of fashion was at Marks & Spencer, a British institution known for its reliability and its quiet, middle-class elegance. She worked as a children's clothing designer, a job that required an immense amount of patience and an eye for the smallest details. The way a button sits, the strength of a hem, the softness of a lining. It was a comfortable life, a safe life. But the ambition forged in the cold living room of her youth was not satisfied by the predictable rhythms of a corporate design office. She was looking for a door that led somewhere grander, somewhere where the stakes were higher and the colors were brighter than the muted tones of a Lincolnshire autumn. In 1988, Jane was 21 years old. She was at a crossroads that many young people face. The choice between the familiar and the unknown. While leafing through a copy of The Lady magazine, a publication known for its classified ads for domestic staff in the upper echelons of society, she saw an anonymous posting. It was a request for a personal dresser. There were no names mentioned, no titles, only a set of requirements that Jane felt she met with room to spare. She responded with a suitcase full of dreams and a heart hardened by the need for security. A few months later, the transition from the mundane to the surreal was complete. Jane found herself standing at the side door of Buckingham Palace, the very heart of the British monarchy. She had arrived at King's Cross Station with just £10 in her pocket and a single suitcase, a modern-day fairy tale beginning in the most literal sense. When the taxi driver made a joke about her destination, she likely felt a surge of that old, Grimsby-born pride. She wasn't just a girl from the coast anymore. She was an initiate into a world of ancient stone and silent service. When she entered her new quarters, she found a small posy of flowers waiting for her. Beside the flowers was a card that read, "Welcome to the team, the boss." It was signed by Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York. In that moment, the cold house of her childhood must have felt like a different lifetime. The air here smelled of beeswax, expensive perfume, and the faint, sweet scent of old paper. Jane was no longer searching for coins in the dark. She was the custodian of silk, the keeper of diamonds, and the confidant of a duchess. She often described herself during this period as a country bumpkin who had suddenly been dropped into a kaleidoscope of royalty. Within weeks, she was at Balmoral, the sprawling Scottish estate where the royals went to escape the public eye. She found herself having long, whispered chats with Princess Diana, sharing the unique camaraderie that exists among those who live within the palace walls, but are never quite of them. For 9 years, Jane was the shadow that ensured the Duchess looked perfect. She handled the intricate beadwork of evening gowns, the heavy velvet of ceremonial robes, and the delicate lace of private moments. She was the one who knew which shoes pinched and which earrings were too heavy. She was essential. However, as the years passed, the line between Jane's professional duty and her personal identity began to blur. In the royal household, the staff often becomes a secondary family, but it is a family with a very clear hierarchy. Jane had been married to Christopher Dunn Butler, an IBM executive, since 1990, but the demands of her royal life, the constant travel, the late nights, the total immersion in the Duchess's world, placed a heavy strain on the union. There were rumors of flings, of a restlessness that couldn't be stilled by the comforts of a steady marriage. By 1995, she was divorced, a life event that served to pull her even closer to Sarah Ferguson, who was navigating her own high-profile separation from Prince Andrew. The two women, the Duchess and the dresser, became a unit of mutual support. They were both women who felt the pressure of public scrutiny and the loneliness of the gilded cage. But the security Jane had sought for so long was built on a foundation of service, and service is a temporary contract. In 1997, the world she had built over nearly a decade came to an abrupt halt. She was let go from the Duchess's staff. The reasons were shrouded in the typical discretion of the palace, but for Jane, the effect was catastrophic. The flowers were no longer fresh. The tea was no longer served by housemaids. She was, once again, a woman on the outside, looking in. The depression that followed was a return to the gray skies of her youth. She felt blindsided, discarded like a garment that had gone out of style. It was in this state of profound vulnerability that she met Thomas Cressman. He was a financier, a man of wealth and charisma, who seemed to offer a new version of the security she had lost. But the patterns of the past have a way of repeating themselves in the shadows of the present. As we move forward into the heart of the night, remember that the rain is still falling, the village is still quiet, and you are tucked away from the reach of these old sorrows. The story is moving toward its inevitable rest, and so are you. The weight of the world is lifting, leaving only the soft, rhythmic sound of the water against the glass. The transition from the palace to the private world of Thomas Cressman was not the clean break Jane had hoped for. It was a shift from one kind of intensity to another. In the high-ceilinged rooms of her new life, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was expectant. She was a woman who had spent years anticipating the needs of a duchess, and now she directed that hypervigilance toward a man who, by all accounts, was as complicated as the world she had left behind. The ambition that had once driven her to the palace gates was now channeled into a desperate need for a permanent home, a marriage, a final anchoring. But as the autumn of 2000 approached, the seams she had so carefully stitched began to fray once more. leading to a night in September that would change everything forever. But that is a path for another time, a further drifting into the history. For now, there is only the rain, the warmth of your blankets, and the knowledge that the story is held safely in the past. You are here, you are still, and the night is long and kind. As the narrative of Jane's life began to take this darker turn, the sensory details of her environment shifted. The grand, sweeping corridors of the palace were replaced by the more intimate, yet perhaps more suffocating, confines of a luxury flat in Fulham. The smell of the North Sea salt was a distant memory, replaced by the scent of expensive cigars and the heavy floral notes of a house that was trying too hard to feel like a home. Jane was a woman who understood the power of an image, but she was finding it increasingly difficult to maintain her own. The country bumpkin had become a sophisticated woman of the world, but underneath the silk scarves and the polished exterior, the girl searching for coins was still there, terrified of being left in the cold. Thomas Cressman was a man who enjoyed the finer things, a man who moved through the world with a confidence that Jane found both intoxicating and intimidating. Their relationship was a whirlwind, a rapid succession of dinners, trips to the coast, and the kind of high-stakes emotional intimacy that can feel like love, but often masks something more volatile. Jane wanted a proposal. She wanted the ring that would signify her permanent status, her final victory over the uncertainty of her upbringing. But Thomas was a man who valued his freedom, a man who viewed commitment through a different lens than the woman who had spent a decade in the service of a traditional institution like the royal family. The tension between them was not a loud, crashing thing at first. It was a series of small, quiet moments, a look held a second too long, a question left unanswered, a door closed with a bit too much force. It was the sound of a ticking clock in a room where no one is speaking. It was the feeling of a thread being pulled, slowly but surely, until the fabric begins to bunch and distort. Jane, ever the dresser, tried to smooth out the wrinkles, tried to mend the tears before they became visible. But some things cannot be mended with a needle and thread. In the late summer of 2000, they traveled to the French Riviera. It should have been a time of sun and sapphire waters, a time to reconnect. Instead, it became the crucible in which their relationship finally disintegrated. The heat of the Mediterranean sun seemed only to bake the resentment deeper into their interactions. By the time they returned to London on the 17th of September, the air between them was electric with the threat of a storm. It was a Sunday, a day that should have been spent in the quietude of a weekend's end, preparing for the week ahead. But for Jane and Thomas, it was the end of something much larger. The argument that night was not about one thing, but about everything. It was about the lost job, the failed marriage, the unoffered ring, and the deep, abiding fear of being nothing. It was about the power dynamics of a man who had everything and a woman who felt she was losing her last grip on the life she had fought so hard to obtain. The police were called, a desperate attempt to bring a third party into a conflict that had become too large for two people to contain. "Someone is going to get hurt," Thomas had said into the receiver, a prophetic warning that hung in the still air of the flat long after the phone was put down. As we sit here in the safety of the present, we can see the tragedy of it. Two people caught in a cycle of their own making, unable to find the words to de-escalate, unable to find the grace to walk away. The night moved on, the hours stretching out like shadows on a wall. The rain in London that night was likely much like the rain we hear now, a steady, indifferent accompaniment to the human drama unfolding behind closed doors. But here, in this space, the drama is over. The storm has passed. We are simply observing the aftermath from a distance, where the edges are soft and the danger is gone. Jane's journey from the quiet desperation of Grimsby to the silent halls of a prison cell is a reminder of the fragility of the structures we build for ourselves. But tonight, your structure is sound. Your bed is a sanctuary. Your room is a fortress of peace. And the story of the royal dresser is just a whisper in the wind. Let the details of her life drift away now, like leaves on a dark river. There's no need to carry her burden. There's only the need to breathe, to sink deeper into the softness of the night, and to let the silence wash over you. The world of Buckingham Palace, with its guards in their scarlet tunics and the hushed efficiency of its staff, feels like a dream when compared to the stark reality of what followed. But even that dream was part of the path that led Jane to where she eventually found herself. Every stitch she sewed, every card she read, every flight she took with the Duchess was a step toward the shadow. And yet, there is a peace in knowing that even the most turbulent lives eventually find a level of stillness. Jane served her time. She sought her quiet, and the world moved on. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the quiet English village we started in. The rain has slowed to a gentle mist, coating the leaves of the oak trees in a fine silver veil. The street lamps are dimming as the first hint of a very distant dawn begins to touch the horizon, though it is still many hours away. The houses are dark, their occupants tucked safely in their beds, just as you are. The history of Jane Andrews is tucked away too, a chapter in a book that has been closed and placed on a high shelf. You don't need to remember the dates or the names. You only need to remember the feeling of the rain and the warmth of the air around you. The ambition, the struggle, the rise, and the fall. It is all part of the human tapestry. But tonight, the tapestry is folded neatly and put away. There is only the breath, the steady rise and fall of your chest, mirroring the rhythm of the tide on the Grimsby coast. The salt air is clean, the wind is a lullaby, and the darkness is a kind, heavy blanket. You are drifting now, away from the stories of the past, and into the wordless peace of the present. The shadows are long, the light is soft, and you are perfectly, wonderfully safe. Sleep now, while the rain tells its quiet story to the glass, and the world waits in silence for the morning. The year was 1988, and the world was bathed in the soft, analog glow of a decade that felt permanent. In a quiet corner of Lincolnshire, a young woman named Jane Andrews sat with a copy of The Lady magazine, her fingers tracing the ink of a small, anonymous advertisement. It was a simple request for a personal dresser, tucked between notices for governesses and estate managers, yet it held the weight of a different life. Jane was 21, a children's clothing designer at Marks and Spencer, who knew the technical language of seams and hemlines. But she was also a girl who had grown up in the quiet tension of a home where money was a ghost, often chased, but rarely caught. She remembered the feeling of searching for spare coins in the crevices of a sofa just to buy a loaf of bread. Now, a single letter sent into the void of a London postbox had returned with an invitation that felt like a bridge to another world. The journey to the capital was marked by the steady, rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks. Jane arrived at King's Cross Station with a single suitcase and 10 pounds in her pocket, the sum total of her past carried into an uncertain future. The air in the station was thick with the scent of diesel and old stone, a bustling contrast to the stillness of the countryside. She stepped into a black taxi, the leather seat cool beneath her, and gave the driver an address that felt like a secret: the side door of Buckingham Palace. The driver made a small, knowing joke, perhaps sensing the transition of a girl who called herself a country bumpkin into something more formal. As the car moved through the streets of London, the heavy iron gates of the palace loomed ahead, separating the mundane roar of the city from a silence that had been cultivated for centuries. Inside the palace, the atmosphere changed instantly. The roar of traffic was replaced by the muffled sound of footsteps on thick, ornate rugs and the distant chime of grandfather clocks. A housemaid met her at the side entrance, leading her through a labyrinth of corridors where the history of an empire was etched into every gilded frame. Jane was shown to her room, a space that felt both grand and intimate. Resting on a table was a small, delicate posy of flowers. Beside it sat a card with a message that would define the next 9 years of her life. It was signed simply, "The Boss." It was her first greeting from Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, and in that moment, the scale of her new reality began to settle. Imagine the click of heels on the marble of a palace corridor. A girl of 21 suddenly finding herself in the inner sanctum of history, surrounded by the scent of beeswax polish and the soft light of chandeliers. Life in the shadow of the Duchess was a choreographed dance of fabric and form. For nearly a decade, Jane's world was defined by the tactile reality of the royal wardrobe. Her hands became accustomed to the heavy weight of silk damask, the delicate grit of lace, and the precise organization required to manage the appearance of one of the world's most photographed women. Each morning began with a ritual of preparation, ensuring that every button was secure and every crease was smoothed away. There were the seasonal migrations to Balmoral, where the air was sharp with the scent of pine and peat smoke, and the wardrobe shifted to heavy wools and sturdy tweeds. In these quiet, private spaces, the hierarchy of the palace softened. Jane wasn't just an employee. She became a constant presence, a silent witness to the private sighs and candid moments of a family that the rest of the world only saw in flashes of camera bulbs. This proximity created what many called the companion effect. As Sarah Ferguson navigated the complexities of royal life and her eventual separation from Prince Andrew, Jane was there, a steady anchor in the storm. Their bond deepened over shared secrets and the mutual understanding that comes from living in close quarters. Jane found herself in casual, drifting conversations with Princess Diana, discussing the mundane details of life that felt strangely normal within the palace walls. It was an era of intimacy, where the rustle of a gown being readied for a gala was the only sound in a room filled with unspoken confidences. In the quiet moments before a public appearance, the bond between a woman and her dresser is one of silence, trust, and the soft rustle of fabric. Yet, as the public glamour of the Yorks continued, Jane's own private life began to fragment. In 1990, she had married Christopher Dunn Butler, an executive who lived in a world of spreadsheets and corporate strategy. The contrast between the gilded halls of her workplace and the reality of her marriage grew increasingly stark. She would later admit to a few flings, small attempts to find a sense of self outside the heavy expectations of her role. When she and Christopher eventually divorced in 1995, the event only served to pull her closer to the Duchess, who was navigating her own divorce from Prince Andrew. They were two women adrift in a sea of tradition, leaning on one another for a sense of stability that the world outside could not provide. But the fairy tale held a sharp, hidden edge. In 1997, after 9 years of service, the connection was abruptly severed. The dismissal came as a shock, a sudden closure of the palace gates that left Jane blindsided and reeling. There were no more posies of flowers or cards from the boss. Instead, there was the cold reality of a layoff and the loss of a family she had come to view as her own. The transition from the inner sanctum to the mundane world was jarring. She fell into a deep, heavy depression, struggling to reconcile the person she had been with the woman she now saw in the mirror. Her identity had been so intertwined with the crown that without it, she felt like a ghost. When the gates of the palace finally close behind you, the silence of the outside world can feel deafening. In the vacuum left by the palace, Thomas Cressman appeared. He was a charismatic financier, a man of sharp suits and confident strides, who seemed to offer the anchor Jane so desperately craved. Their romance was a whirlwind, a rapid escalation of emotion fueled by Jane's need for security and Thomas's magnetic presence. She pinned all her hopes on him, imagining a life where the uncertainty of her post-royal existence would be replaced by the permanence of a marriage proposal. They traveled together, dining in expensive restaurants and moving through circles that felt familiar to Jane's past. But beneath the surface, the foundation was crumbling. The dynamic was one of deep-seated friction. Jane was the ultimate in insecurity, while Thomas was the ultimate in commitment phobia. The tension followed them to the French Riviera, a place of bright sun and azure waters that should have been a sanctuary. Instead, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken grievances. They would threaten to leave one another, only for Thomas to reel her back in with promises of change or the dangling of a future that never quite arrived. Jane felt as though she were being played like an instrument, her emotions pulled and pushed by a man who knew exactly which strings to touch. The heat of the Mediterranean sun seemed to bake the resentment into the very stones of the villas they visited. Thomas was a man who knew which strings to pull, and Jane was a woman who was tired of drifting. By the time they returned to Thomas's home in London on September 17, 2000, the air was electric with the coming storm. An argument broke out over the future of their relationship, a circular conflict that had no resolution. The words exchanged were sharp and final. At one point, the fear in the house became so palpable that Thomas called the police, his voice recorded on a 911 line stating that someone was going to get hurt, and he wanted someone there to stop them. It was a moment of terrifying clarity. Jane would later allege that the night escalated into physical and sexual abuse, a claim the prosecution would later frame as the desperate narrative of a woman scorned by a man who refused to marry her. The air in the room was heavy with words that could never be taken back, a storm breaking inside the house while the street remained still. The end did not come with a shout, but in the heavy, clinical silence of the early morning hours. As Thomas slept, the physical reality of the conflict reached its tragic conclusion. Jane, moving in a state that felt removed from herself, used a cricket bat and a knife. The description of the act in the later trial was forensic, a sequence of movements that resulted in the end of a life and the beginning of a tragedy. There was no immediate chaos, only the settling of a heavy stasis. Jane fled the scene, disappearing into the night as the world outside continued its slow, indifferent rotation. She was found days later, following an overdose, a woman who had traded the silks of a palace for the sterile white of a hospital room. The transition from the persona of the lady to that of the defendant was swift and absolute. The trial in the spring of 2001 stripped away the remaining layers of her royal associations, replacing them with the cold language of evidence and testimony. The public, once captivated by the fairy tale dresser, now watched a woman who seemed broken by the weight of her own choices. Justice is often a slow, rhythmic process of filing papers and quiet courtrooms, far removed from the heat of the moment. As the judge delivered a life sentence, the story of the girl from Lincolnshire came to a rest in the stillness of a prison cell, the echoes of the palace gates finally fading into the long, quiet shadows of the past.